Now, Christina Keneally, Ross, your former colleague at Sky, she has said on multiple occasions that she grew up in a Ronald Reagan household and that she likes Ronald Reagan, but the Republicans have moved so far to the right since that. Now, that is total nonsense. And here she is, slagging off CPAC, who gave us Ronald Reagan.
Well, g'day, good morning, good evening, wherever you are on this little blue dot we call the Earth. My name's Ross Cameron, a former Member of Parliament in the Howard government, former Sky News commentator, basically former everything. But as Ronald Reagan said to CPAC in his opening address, there's had enough time for sentimentality and looking backwards. And I'm here seated with the great John Ruddick,
Thank you
author of Make the Liberal Party Great Again. Obviously a direct rip-off from our favourite property developer from New York. How are you there, Johnny?
I'm terrific. I'm looking forward to CPAC this week, Ross.
So here we are. CPAC is the acronym on everybody's lips. Johnny, what does CPAC stand for?
It's the Conservative Political Action Conference, and I really think, Ross, we should start off by thanking Christina Keneally and Penny Wong for giving the event a lot of publicity. It's the inaugural one in Australia, and this time a week ago, most people hadn't even heard of it.
Yes, so we've got Nanny number 1 and National Nanny number 2 in Christina Keneally and Penny Wong, both Labor Party senators and identity queens, if you like. And Senator Wong, and what is quite an irony, because we find two former Labor leaders on diametrically opposed sides of the argument, as CPAC is coming to Australia for the very first time. This blue chip political stock. Vice President Mike Pence last year described CPAC as the preeminent conservative event in the United States. It certainly has attracted the biggest names on the side of conservative politics and thinking since the very first conference in 1973. We're going to go back to that, but let us start with the controversy, the thing which has really brought us out of our usual quiet Australians. We're one of Scott Morrison's quiet Australians, aren't we?
We are now, yes.
And we had earlier this week, we might as well get the quotes correct. So we start out with Christina Keneally, July 30. While CPAC may have an innocent name, it definitely is not innocent by nature. Play scary music. The event marks the normalisation of the extreme right in Australia. Is Scott Morrison comfortable with his MPs sharing the stage with these people? Question mark. Christina Keneally. So in stereo, we got the handbag hit squad. Out came Senator Penny Wong, July 31, at Senator Wong on Twitter. A conference sounds like a place where harmless ideas are discussed. CPAC is not. It has been an extremist breeding ground in the US. We do not need to import its anti-Semitism, white supremacy and bigotry to Australia because presumably the Australian Labor Party already has enough anti-Semitism. Johnny, let's talk about... now, we did actually get a response. And so Christina Keneally has called for the banning of Raheem Kassim, the Brexit bad boy, former Muslim who has expressed concerns about his faith. Raheem is on the record in response to these developments, but tell us, give us the context of this dispute.
Okay, well, look, the first thing is, what I can't understand is why the left, the Labor Party is represented by these two people, keep employing this failed strategy of demonising mainstream conservatives. This is why the Labor Party has lost 7 of the last 9 federal elections in this country. That is a very lopsided scoreboard, and that is because they get mainstream conservatives, this is the Labor Party, they get mainstream conservatives like us, like the Liberal Party, and they maliciously attack them in a very unfair manner. Now, what that does is that drives Middle Australia against the Labor Party and towards the Liberal Party. So I think, look, a lot of people are talking about CPAC now in Australia. A lot of people don't know what it is, and maybe some people have been misled by our Labor friends. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to correct the record.
Well, let's go back. We have as our backdrop a kind of, we're a sort of a little temple to the Gipper, to Ronald Reagan. John Ruddick I regard as a scholar of the US presidency. Where does Ronald Reagan rank?
Oh well, look! It's you've got some godlike figures who have been the American president. So you've got Washington and Lincoln and Jefferson. Now Reagan is right up there. And the important thing to know about CPAC is that CPAC was created by the supporters of Ronald Reagan in the early 70s, and Reagan himself played a role as his vehicle to become the president of the United States. So it's a very glorious record that this event in Sydney later this week stands on the shoulders of.
So we have the first CPAC took place in 1973 at a pretty low moment for the Republican Party, and it was effectively the right wing of the Republican Party.
It was the libertarian wing, the small government wing, which the mainstream Republicans had given up on.
And so, walk us through the atmosphere of 1973 after the absolutely tumultuous events of 1972 in the United States.
Okay, so look, what had happened since the Republic after the Civil War, the Republicans ran America. They completely dominated both the Congress and the White House up until the Great Depression. Now, then the Great Depression hit. And in let's say, the first presidential election was 1932, which Franklin Roosevelt won by a mile on a very economically left-wing agenda. And that agenda was considered to be, it won over millions and millions of new supporters. And in the 11 presidential elections between 1932 and 1972, the Democrats won 7 out of 11. So they had dominance. And it wasn't just at the presidential level, it was at the state governor levels and in the Congress. The Republicans had won 4 elections. 2 of them were Eisenhower, who did not win on an ideological agenda. He won because of his popularity after winning World War II. Sort of makes you popular when you do something like that. Now then in 1968, Ronald Reagan ran as the Conservative candidate for the Republican nomination. Richard Nixon won the nomination that year, and Reagan came third. But it was an impressive third, and it cemented him really as the leader of the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Now, by the time of Nixon's re-election in 1972, Nixon had a very acrimonious relationship with the conservative wing, which was very much a minority wing. The conservatives were appalled with his economic policies. So even though the lefties out there think that Nixon is this right-wing monster, it is not true. People were urging Reagan to start a new political party. Now, I want to read out this quote here from, look, there's so many good books on Reagan out there, but my favourite Reagan scholar is Craig Shirley. And he wrote a book about 10 years ago called The Reagan Revolution, The Untold Story of the Campaign That Started It All. And this is about his run for the presidency in 1976. And
now, was that the run in which he was betrayed by Barry Goldwater?
It was.
After he had gone to the mat, had been willing to go down with the ship, Barry sort of shafted him when it was... Anyway, go ahead, don't let me...
No, it is worth mentioning it because, Fox News had this fabulous series a few years ago on the history of the conservative movement since World War II, and they said, before Ronald Reagan, there was Barry Goldwater, and before Barry Goldwater, there was William F. Buckley. Now, what had happened in 1964, Barry Goldwater, which was just after a year after the assassination of JFK, which was obviously a very dramatic event, and it was always going to make it very difficult for JFK's vice president, Lyndon Johnson, not to be re-elected.
Yes.
But the Republicans put up Barry Goldwater, who had the same message of Reagan. It was a very bold, anti-socialist, Cold War hawk message.
Small government,
low
taxes.
Absolutely, and really unashamedly saying these things, okay, which Republicans had been ashamed of.
He was an Ayn Rand supporter explicitly, wasn't he?
Well,
whereas
right.
Others were sort of, even the great Maggie Thatcher and to some extent our man Ronald,
yes,
were not explicit in their support for Ayn Rand in the way that Barry Goldwater was.
Correct. So Barry Goldwater is heading for a massive defeat in 1964, and Richard Nixon, who had been the Republican candidate only 4 years earlier, he didn't want anything to do with the Goldwater campaign. And people were saying that Goldwater is hell-bent on starting a nuclear war and all these horrible things. Now then, Ronald Reagan bursts onto the scene, and he was well known to Americans, obviously, as a movie star. And his movie star, he was really a big movie star in the late 40s, early 50s. And then he had, and he used to be a Liberal Democrat himself. He used to be a big supporter of Franklin Roosevelt. But then he saw
In fact, he was a registered Democrat.
He was.
Yes.
He was. Now then, what happened was Reagan just spontaneously started giving these speeches across California, saying, "Look, I think Barry Goldwater was a great guy." The Goldwater campaign heard about this movie star, this very telegetic, very likeable movie star, giving these fabulous speeches in his favour when no one else was, or almost nobody else was. And so the Goldwater campaign rang up Reagan and said, "Look, we've heard about this great speech. We've got a bit of money in the campaign coffers. Can we pay for half an hour on national TV to broadcast your speech?" And Ronald Reagan said, "Of course, I'd be delighted to." Now, I know it seems like it would be an easy thing to accept, but the thing is, this was clearly a failing campaign.
Yes.
But Reagan said, "Look, I don't mind going down with the ship because
Yeah.
I believe in this."
Yes.
So Reagan absolutely, as you say, went to the mat for Goldwater.
Yeah.
And then unfortunately in 1976, which we'll get to soon, when Reagan's running for president in the Republican nomination, Barry Goldwater didn't return the favour.
Yes.
And then when they get into the White House, Nancy Reagan refused to have Barry Goldwater ever step foot inside.
Nancy did not forget, did she?
Nancy did
No.
not forget. But look, the lesson of Goldwater teaches me that everyone is imperfect.
Yes.
Everybody can make mistakes.
Yes.
And we can still honour and admire Barry Goldwater.
Yes.
And accept his errors.
Yes, as I suppose, if not for the influence of Nancy, I mean, Reagan was quite a forgiving bloke, wasn't he?
Yes.
And indeed, we must say, I want to come back, speaking of sort of forgiving, because there was a that speech given by Reagan, cut up, adopted by the Goldwater campaign and published on national television, was really the sort of political launch
Of Ronald
Reagan.
It's a brilliant speech.
But then the next one, another Reagan speech which lit up the room and had quite a big impact, was immediately following his losing campaign for the Republican nomination.
Yes.
When he was invited to speak by the bloke who beat him.
Yes, Gerald Ford.
Tell us that story.
Okay, well look, it's a fascinating story. I do want to read this quote.
Okay, geez, we haven't even got to the first quote. We're 20 minutes in. Read it out.
Okay, so this is Craig Shirley talking about the Reagan 76 campaign, but he's describing the environment in which that campaign began. Now, this is in the middle of Watergate, and why it's relevant is this is when CPAC was born in mid-74, just before Nixon resigns. And Craig Shirley writes, by late summer 1974, the Republican Party was in its death throes, bereft, beraggled, unloved and unwanted. It stood for nothing and antagonised everyone. If the GOP had been a stray cat, it would have been hauled away to an animal shelter and immediately euthanised. No one would have claimed it. The many psychological problems of the Republican Party would have baffled a convention of psychiatrists, not that they would want to have cured the GOP anyway. It suffered from multiple personality disorder, an inferiority complex, delusions of persecution, and was committing slow suicide. The headquarters for this party of losers, the Republican National Committee on Capitol Hill in Washington, had actually produced buttons that idiotically proclaimed, "Republicans are people too," as if to remove all doubt.
A suicide note.
Yes. As if to remove all doubt about the Republicans' insecurities and cowardice, the Republicans were manufactured in a bright yellow. Okay, so in that environment, the Republican president, Richard Nixon, resigns, and the biggest political scandal. In disgrace, no question. And CPAC was born into this environment. Now, and it was this minority group within the Republican Party. Look, what a lot of people don't realise is that the Democrats for decades, I mean, they had been a party of slavery and they had been the party of the South up until the past generation or so. The Democrats were the ones who were struggling with civil rights. The Republicans were always in favour of civil rights. When Lyndon Johnson was a Democratic president, but when he got the civil rights legislation through the Congress, pretty much every Republican supported him. It was the Democrats that were struggling.
The Southern Democrats.
Correct. Now, but the one thing that had always united the Democrats, they were extremely broad, but the thing that they all believed in bigger government. So even if you were a Southern Dixiecrat, you wanted bigger government. And a lot of the Republicans the majority of Republicans, people like Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon, were going along with this agenda. And it was a very small little group led by Reagan that said, hey, no, we've got to reverse the power of the state. Very similar. It was paralleled with what Margaret Thatcher was doing in the Conservative Party at the time.
Okay, hit pause 1 second. The very first CPAC, there was like 120 people there. It was a small group. But now, was that 1973 or 70?
It was 74.
74, okay.
It was mid-74.
Okay, and it was hosted by the American Conservative Union.
Yes.
Which was really a vehicle created to blow wind into Ronald Reagan's sails. Is that fair or unfair?
It was a way it was the vehicle for Ronald Reagan to become the president. But the very interesting thing is this: CPAC was bitterly split, not bitterly, but it was pretty seriously split in those first couple of meetings, because this is the big debate. Do we persist with the Republican Party, or do we start our own third party?
Yes.
And one of the founders of CPAC got up there and said, hey, look, the purpose of CPAC is to start our own party. Ronald Reagan got up and he said, no, I'm sorry, that is not our agenda. And I've got another quote from Craig Shirley. So this is the second CPAC. At the 1975 CPAC, Stan Evans, chairman of the American Conservative Union, urged the Republican Party to chart a more conservative course, but he held out the option of a national third party for presidential campaigns. Reagan also addressed the annual gathering of Conservatives at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, which was sponsored by the ACU and others. Reagan poured yet another bucket of cold water on the idea of a third party, saying, is it a third party we need, or is it a new, revitalised second party, raising a banner of no pale pastels, but bold colours which make it unmistakably clear where we stand on the issues troubling the people?
Okay, now I'm going to say, John Ruddick, you have been a major agitator for democratic reform of the Liberal Party of Australia. Effectively, not to be confused with the North American idea of Liberal as the progressives.
Yes.
And Australia's Liberal Party, since the time of Menzies, has been the centre-right alternative to Labor,
Yes.
Often in coalition with the National Party. But you have agitated for democratic reform of the Liberal Party, in part based on the success of the move to the primary system,
Yes.
away from the caucus system for selecting leaders, that has been the feature of both Republican and Democratic parties in the United States. And indeed, Reagan himself was both an advocate for the democratic reform of the Republican Party and a beneficiary of it.
That's exactly
Tell us
correct.
that story.
Okay, look, and CPAC plays a role in this. So there was this debate about whether they go third party or whether they reform the existing party.
Yes.
Okay, so the big thing was they were saying, look, to become a presidential candidate prior to 1976, it was similar to getting the numbers together to win a party room ballot in Canberra, where you just had to call on favours from factional bosses from all across the
Smoky back rooms and faceless men.
Precisely. And so Reagan and others came along, and CPAC said, look, what we need to do is have a primary to elect our presidential candidates. The Democrats had embraced primaries in 50 states in 1972. And so it was certainly the trend at the time, and thank God they did bring in primaries. So they bring in primaries for the 1976 presidential election. Nixon's resigned. Nixon's vice president is now the president, Gerald Ford. Now, you couldn't ask for a more soft, wishy-washy Republican than Gerald Ford. Might have been a nice guy, but he was as weak as you could get, and he despised Reagan. And so there's all this talk, will Reagan challenge Ford for the Republican nomination? Now, no sitting president had been challenged by somebody from their own party since 1912, and when that happened, the party lost badly. That was the Republican Party as well. Now, so Reagan launches this challenge against the incumbent president, extremely audacious, and he gets off to a dreadful start. But then he found his footing, and it almost always when there's a primary, like we're witnessing now with the Democrats, it's well known who's going to be the candidate months before the convention, and the convention has now just become a coronation.
Yes.
But what had happened in 1976 was it was unclear who was. They had to take it to the convention to have a convention vote.
So they did not know who the winner was going to be before that vote. You can imagine the tension in the room.
Oh, it was bitter. It was palpable. Now then, what had happened is Ford had won most of the first half of the primaries. Okay, so but then Reagan had won the second half.
So when you say Reagan had a terrible start,
yes,
what was it?
Well, what happened, I think it was in Michigan, which happens to be Ford's home state, is that he had some speaking notes, I think it was on national television, and he dropped them in the middle of the speech, and he had to put them back together.
Yeah.
And they were
in the wrong order.
They were in the wrong order.
Yes.
And it did not look good.
Got it.
And everyone and Ford kept saying, "Oh, well, he's a movie star. He might sound good, but he's only good when he's got rehearsed lines."
Yes.
Okay. So then they get to the convention, and they have massive fight for about 3 days over the rules. And as a son of the New South Wales Liberal Party, Rossio, you would have seen one or two floor fights about rules yourself,
sure.
okay? Because it's not democratic. And the Reagan people wanted to get the Mississippi. It all came down to the 1976 convention. The Mississippi delegates. The Mississippi delegates mostly wanted to vote for Reagan, but a rule change meant that they couldn't change the vote, and they were committed to Ford. So Ford wins the nomination. He gets up and gives his victory speech, which most people say is one of his better speeches. And Reagan and Nancy are right up the back of the convention. And Gerald Ford wanting to unite the party. I mean, believe me, this was as bitter as you could get. It would almost be a little bit like Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott, having a public reconciliation. Gerald Ford says,
Come on down,
Ronnie," and it's all on YouTube. It's fabulous. And Ronnie says, "No. This is a moment for the president. Yeah, we hope he wins." And then the crowd says, "We want Reagan. We want Reagan." So then Reagan goes down to the convention, to the floor, and he gives one of the great performances in his life. And he got huge ovation, bigger than Gerald Ford had only moments earlier.
Do we know if that speech was extempore or
It was.
No.
It was. Because he was not expecting it.
He wasn't expecting it. And
Correct.
that added, I think, to the electricity
Yes.
of what came out of his mouth.
That's right.
Yes.
So by the end of that speech, everybody has basically said, we
picked the wrong guy.
We picked the wrong guy. Okay, so then Gerald Ford goes on and loses pretty significantly to Jimmy Carter. So then the question then is, who's going to be the Republican candidate in 1980? And so then the Reagan 80 campaign comes along. Now, of course, the same group of people who was saying, who say today, the Never Trump movement. Now, they're almost an extinct species now, but you would remember 4 years ago, the Never Trumpers were huge. All the big names, or most of the big names, the Bush family, National Review, certainly John McCain and others, were saying, "Never Trump, never Trump." Well, a lot of those people in the late 70s were never Reagan.
Yes.
In fact, some of the same people.
And indeed, the Australian media, I mean, I remember as a young person watching the Reagan campaign,
Right.
and you basically had this virtually unanimous cult-like decision by Australian media to represent Reagan as a B-grade movie actor buffoon. And that's all I remembered from watching it.
Yes.
Was B-grade movie actor Ronald Reagan.
Who wanted to start a nuclear war with the Soviets.
Yes.
And of course he did the opposite. He disarmed the Soviets. Okay, so Reagan's vehicle to win in 1980 was again CPAC. Reagan did not just speak at the first CPAC, he spoke 13 times throughout his career at CPAC. Now, for people who have registered in Australia for the first CPAC, there were, if you happen to be a wealthy person and you want to pay about $500, you get the the VIP pass, which
Yes.
is called the Reagan VIP pass.
Yes.
CPAC is Reagan, Reagan is CPAC.
Yeah.
Now, Christina Keneally, Ross, your former colleague at Sky, she has said on multiple occasions that she grew up in a Ronald Reagan household and that she likes Ronald Reagan, but the Republicans have moved so far to the right since that. Now, that is total nonsense. And here she is, slagging off CPAC, who gave us Ronald Reagan.
Yes, we then see that what started out as this kind of ragtag bunch of a few little resistors wanting to keep alive the sort of libertarian minimalist view of genuinely seeking to restrain the growth of the state. We find its womb, if you like, is CPAC. And if you say there are parts of the galaxy which manufacture stars, CPAC has this sense that people go along to see who is the emerging star in the firmament. And it's sort of often the introduction of the next big thing, whether it's in the Congress, in the Senate, or one of the governors, or indeed, we must say, Donald Trump, who was none of those things. He was an outsider.
Yes.
And Trump has had a very friendly relationship, a bit controversial in moments, with CPAC. And so they've gone from the 120 in the first one to, I mean, there's well over, they fill a stadium now.
Yeah.
And what we also see is more than half of the attenders are sort of college age, university age. There is a great deal of young people are introduced to the sort of energy of centre-right, libertarian, small government, conservative politics. But we know a little bit. I mean, Christina is saying that she's desperately keen to use the word extremist. Penny Wong is jumping on board the bandwagon, swinging her handbag for all she's worth. We do know a little bit about the actual sentiment, not so much of the speakers, but of the CPAC audience. So why don't you tell us what research tells us is important to these alleged white supremacists and extremists that Christina Keneally and Penny Wong want to have banned from Australia?
Okay, so well, in 2010 there was a poll taken of the CPAC attendees that year, because it's an annual event in Washington every year. And in 2010 I asked, what's the most important issue for you? And 85% of people said reducing government and government spending. 10% said it was eliminating abortion. And 1% said it's stopping same-sex marriage. 1%. Now, I would say that a majority of CPAC attendees, or at least a significant number, were pro-same-sex marriage well before our friends in the Labor Party were.
Well, indeed, Penny Wong, has never been quite sure what her position is on gay marriage, and for quite a long time opposed it, as indeed did Bill Shorten, as indeed did Prime Minister Julia Gillard, as indeed for a long time did Kevin Rudd, and so Labor has been all over the shop on this issue.
Yes.
CPAC did have a bit of an internal argument when a group which no longer exists but was something like Gay Patriots for America or Conservative Gays or something like that sought to register to attend CPAC. They were duly admitted to attend. It did create a few sort of dropouts as a result, but the leadership of CPAC said, well, drop out if you wish. And Coulter famously said that our gays are more macho than their straights. But CPAC has been never been an organisation focused on the extreme, and indeed has excluded a number of what might be described as white supremacist sympathetic organisations.
Oh, they won't get anywhere near the front door. Look. Of course, you're going to have in a country of 330 million people. You're going to have some people on the extreme left, and you're going to have some people on the extreme right. It's always been the case. It always will be the case. Now, these people are not welcome at CPAC. Now, Christina or Penny Wong has referred to CPAC as an anti-Semitic organisation. Now, I doubt you could put 10,000 people together that would be more pro the state of Israel and generally in support of the Jewish contribution to humanity than the CPAC attendees.
Well, you would think that would have been a relevant consideration in Benjamin Netanyahu's decision to address CPAC.
That's right. Good point. Good point.
But no, we have seen this this absolute constellation. Charlton Heston has spoken at CPAC. Obviously, Rush Limbaugh. The big, all besides whoever are the contenders and the candidates coming forward, we find the intellectual leadership. Steve Bannon has been a significant feature. Newt Gingrich, a big feature of CPAC. These are the kind of guys and girls. Sarah Palin, who I think famously told CPAC that he's got the rifle and I've got the rack. So tell us, here we're going to go back to, because we could talk all day, but let's talk about Raheem. He's got a tweet. He's described as Raheem the naughty nationalist. He says, I could be playing up and milking this Australia visa thing, but honestly, I'm not a grifter and I can't be asked. If psychos like Albo MP and @K Keneally are so scared of a former Muslim expressing concerns about the faith he was raised with, then let them whinge. No one cares. So tell us if somebody knows nothing about Raheem Kassam, what would John Ruddick say about Raheem?
Okay, well look. You know, a few years ago there was a speaker at CPAC who was from the organisation Atheists for America. Okay, and so CPAC has lots of different divergent views, and they welcome them. Okay, now this guy Raheem, I don't know that much about him. I know what Christina has said about him. Under the protection of parliamentary privilege, Raheem has said, please step outside of Parliament and repeat those comments because I'd like to take you to court for defamation. She hasn't done that yet. Now, he's basically Nigel Farage's best friend and number one political advisor. Now, Farage and Raheem, after Brexit won, they basically walked away from politics. They said, look, we've won, our job is done, we're really pleased, great, we're independent.
Like who was the great Roman reformer?
Cincinnatus.
That's right. Was it land reform? What was Cincinnatus's great it was
it was to do with helping set up the Tribune of the Plebs, I think. This was in the early days of the Republic.
Okay, great.
So blurry.
Okay, so Nigel Farage likewise went back, went
to the private sector.
Back to the private sector.
He did. Now, then what happened, his party, UKIP, which had given us the referendum and won the referendum, because it really had no purpose anymore, but it still had a party structure, it got taken over by right-wing, like extreme right-wing white supremacists. There's always been that element in Britain. That got taken over by UKIP, and they made Raheem and Nigel Farage extremely unwelcome. That's why they've started the Brexit Party. So if you were just listening to what Christina Keneally said about Raheem, you would think, well, he's one of these street violent, extreme right-wing guys in England. Well, he's the guy that they were against. So, and look, he was the editor of Breitbart. Now, again, Breitbart has its critics, but only from people who've never read it. They might have read what other people say about Breitbart, but look, I like Breitbart. It's a reputable source.
Look, we have to say that this is the classic Saul Alinsky strategy being rolled out by the left, by Penny Wong and Christina Keneally. Their basic view seems to be that the definition of a bigot is someone who disagrees with me. but they are adopting, in the case of Raheem Kassim, the Saul Alinsky strategy, where he says in Rules for Radicals, which was indeed the subject of Hillary Clinton's master's thesis at the all-female college she attended, I forget its name. Wesley. And that thesis on Saul Alinsky, the so-called community organiser, the sort of intellectual power behind that group of hardcore, really revolutionary Marxists, the Weather Underground, this type of thing.
Yes.
And he said that in his Rules for Radicals, there was about 13 rules, and one of them was attack individuals rather than institutions, because individuals hurt faster.
Well, what he was saying is he gave the example when he goes through his Rules for Radicals. Now, look, by the way, his book is dedicated to Lucifer, so that is also worth noting, Alinsky. Now, in his rules, he says, one of them is what you've been saying, don't focus on the organisation, pick an individual, focus all your anger and hate on them. And the example they give is, let's say you want to shut down a car plant because they're not paying people enough money. Don't attack Ford, attack the CEO of Ford. So make one person the villain to attack the whole organisation, consciously or not. This is what Christina Keneally and Penny Wong are doing with Raheem. They're focusing on him. Look, I'm not sure of every comment he's ever made in his life. There is a Muslim speaking at Australian APAC, your friend, Tanvir.
Tanvir Ahmed.
Yes.
I don't know how Tanvir. He certainly comes from a Muslim background.
Yeah, Bangladeshi. Yeah, look, I spoke to him not long ago.
He would describe himself as a Muslim.
He told me, look, he will attend the mosque, several times a year.
Right. So look, here we go. We want to congratulate Andrew Cooper from Liberty Works.
Oh, very much so.
Who was the sort of entrepreneurial guy who reached out to CPAC and said, look, we want to bring this blue chip political stock across the Pacific and create this same sort of fertile environment for rational thought, reason-based, liberty-oriented. And Andrew Cooper, who is a publisher, a conference host and organiser with Liberty Works, each year running significant events in Australia, but has succeeded in bringing some. We've got a number of US Congress men and women, I think, coming.
We've got Judge Janine from Fox News.
Judge Janine.
Nigel Farage.
Hopefully
the next Prime Minister of Great Britain.
Couldn't get much bigger. Former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, I think, will be speaking.
Peter Credlin.
Peter Credlin. And we've got the absolute stars opening the conference. The biggest three names on the right of Australian politics.
Yes. Yourself.
Oh, myself. Yes. I'm sorry.
Rowan Dean and Mark Latham. Yes. So
Rowan Dean, editor of Spectator Australia, and Mark Latham, now member of the New South Wales Legislative Council for the One Nation Party, but a former national leader of the Australian Labor Party, is opening the CPAC Australia's first minted edition, a former leader of the Australian Labor Party. And this is the event that Christina Keneally wishes to have banned.
See what they are. They don't want Conservatives to meet and discuss ideas. They don't want the public to hear Conservatives discuss ideas. They're scared of it because they know that if the public do hear our ideas without the slander from these guys, that we'll win over more voters. That's what they're scared of. Now, what's the left-wing equivalent in Australia to CPAC? It's the annual Festival of Dangerous Ideas.
Yes.
Now, do we ever... Now, I went through their list of speakers this morning. On their website, they've got every person that spoke to them in the last 10 years. I mean, there's some pretty far left people there. Do we care? Do we ever think... We might say that we disagree with what they say. Do we ever try and stop them getting a visa? Do we ever try and shut down the thing? Now, I suspect that there's a decent chance there'll be protesters out the front of CPAC. Do we ever go and have a protest out the front of Festival of Dangerous Ideas? Absolutely not. Why is that, ladies and gentlemen? Basically because right-wingers, Conservatives, are more civilised than the people on the left.
Yes, there does seem to be this emerging feature of left progressive thought that if it's not tinged with a bit of street violence, it lacks authenticity. You know,
Yes.
if there's not some Antifa protester in a black helmet and some sort of what do bandits wear when they go balaclava? You know, this is the image of the progressive left, the balaclava-clad university student bashing some poor pensioner in a "Make Australia Great Again" cap. Well, look, we're going to move. Draw this thing to a conclusion. We do wish to say congratulations, CPAC, on what has been a significant contribution to the culture of the greatest nation since the Roman Empire. We're absolutely thrilled to have CPAC on Australian shores.
Well, we are the first country that they have exported CPAC to.
Right.
And look, I would say that the organisers a couple of weeks ago may have been wondering, well, is this going to be a one-off? Is it going to be underwhelming? Well, look, thanks to Christina Keneally and Penny Wong, I can sense it's going to be a huge success, and it's now going to be a part of the Australian political landscape for decades to come.
Well, look, I did receive a text message earlier today from a Queenslander who is flying down to Sydney for the event and who has said, "Lucky I bought my VIP CPAC ticket 2 weeks ago. All sold out."
Oh, good to hear.
Thanks to Christina Keneally. There you go. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us. It's been a pleasure. I'm gonna hand to John for one last thought from Ronald Reagan. This thing is imbued with his spirit.
It is.
So give us a little bit of the Gipper before we go.
Okay, so New York Times, 1976, Reagan's thinking about challenging the incumbent president. And this is what the New York Times said about the potential of Reagan running. "There is only one way, it seems to us, in which the Republicans could dig their own political grave for 1976 as surely as anything can be done in American politics. That is, by capitulating to the far right of the party that forms the core support of Governor Reagan in his quest for the nomination. To put it in the crudest political terms, the far right of the GOP has no place to go, yet the nomination of Governor Reagan for the presidency, or for that matter even the vice presidency on a Ford ticket, would surely alienate the most important centrist and liberal segments of the Republican Party, without whose support it could not conceivably achieve national success." So they were 100% wrong there. And the very last thing I'll say, this is Time magazine 10 years later, 6 years into the glorious 8 years of Ronald Reagan. This is what Time magazine said about Reagan. They talking about his speech at CPAC, which had just taken place, and they said, "Speakers and delegates alike credited Reagan with having permanently changed the national agenda to make the Conservative voice not just relevant, but dominant." Now, the Reagan and Thatcher revolutions not only revitalised their own countries, I think even of global importance, third world countries that had been basically socialist/communist countries from the Cold War up until the 1990s, after they saw the success of Reaganism and Thatcherism, thanks to CPAC, they embraced their economic policies. And that the third world poverty is evaporating very, very rapidly. I saw a thing recently that said in the last 10 years, 250 million people in India have been lifted out of grinding poverty in just the last 10 years. Now, that's because of the economic policies and the political approach of people like Ronald Reagan. And we would not have Ronald Reagan without CPAC. So thank you, CPAC. Thank you for coming to Australia, and looking forward to a fun convention.
Well, there it is, ladies and gentlemen. God bless America. Best wishes to CPAC Australia. You've been with John Ruddick, author of Make the Liberal Party Great Again. I'm Ross Cameron. Until next time, God bless, Godspeed.